ask permission of all the energies of this place, Wat Mapjan, and also the lay people, to give a talk this afternoon. And it's quite nice that I'm back here. I'm able to come back here. I wasn't actually sure if my schedule would work out to come back here, but it did for Tan Ajahn Ñāniko's birthday time. I'll be here until the 1st of April. And just over a month ago, last gave a talk here when there was an online retreat, and there are people here in person as well. And that was before I was going to this India trip, so I was talking about some of my determinations and going into that trip, of course not knowing what was going to happen. So now is a good time to have a sort of debrief and talk about what did actually happen, how it did actually play out. And it brings up various reflections about determination in our own practice and the importance of determination. The word is adhitthana, but it can be interpreted in various ways. And so what does that mean for our practice? How is it useful for us, and how does it help us with the various practices that we take on? Because I do think it's a very important underlying quality with whatever we're practicing. So these practices that we do, of whether it's metta practice or a sukha practice or death contemplation or any other practice that the Buddha recommended, Buddha Nusati, recollection of the Buddha, Dhamma Nusati, recollection of the Dhamma, Sangha Nusati, recollection of the Sangha. All of these have an underlying, however they're going to play out, all these practices are very important, but what's underlying them is our determination or the intention we bring to the practice. And so this sense of determination and perseverance are qualities that will determine whether or not all of those other practices succeed. So this is super important to be cultivating. So that was very much the theme of this trip to India. And I was doing sometimes daily, sometimes every other day, audio updates, which I sent to not that many people. So I'll talk about just some of the highlights of the trip, and then weave in some of the Dhamma themes that maybe I took away from it, and hopefully inspire all of you to practice more and go beyond your self-created limitations. Because sometimes we have a certain comfort zone that we like to stay in, and we might feel that it's actually useful to stay within that comfort zone. We don't want to push the boundaries too much because we might feel irritated or tired, or we might feel exhausted or feel that we're struggling. And yet it's actually necessary to push ourselves in that way. And it's only natural that obstructive states and defilements will be brought up when we push ourselves in that way. And that's really how we learn how to see them. If we don't ever push ourselves in that way, they remain hidden, and we end up settling for a state of mediocrity in our practice. And so certainly all of the Kruba Ajahns, whether it was Luang Cha or Tan Ajahn Anan or any of the Western Ajahns, Luang Por Sumedho and all of the others, Luang Por Pasano, trying to push ourselves out of our self-perceived limits. And this is really how we see the defilements, how we see dukkha. So important. And yes, we can stay within our comfort zone, and we will, if we practice mindfulness within our comfort zone, we will have a better life. We will have a bit more well-being and a bit more happiness, and that's good too. So if that's all we're able to do at this point, that's better than not doing any practice at all, certainly. But we can do better. We can do better, and that takes the determination to practice. And it takes faith, saddha, and not just faith in Buddha, but faith in ourselves to be able to do it. Faith as a quality in and of itself. It takes that to have the courageousness to do these determinations, make these determinations. So going into the India trip, my original determination was which I announced in my last talk here. I still have some of India inside of me. Which I announced in my last talk here and it was a determination I had made before when I was last in India that I eventually would do, was to do a 3 Steps One Vow practice, and bowing Tibetan style, full body prostration, stomach onto the ground, head touching the ground, and then back up. The 3 Steps One Vow, circumambulating the outer circumambulation bath of the Mahabodhi Stupa, and do 10,000 of those bows. And because I had a month, that's quite a bit of time, I also added in to do 108 hours of sitting meditation in the complex and close to the Bodhi tree. So there was those 2 determinations. So the way it played out was I was a bit nervous about the 3 Steps One Vow because I know it's a public park, it's a public area. And so doing 3 Steps One Vow, it's a marble path. For those who aren't familiar with it, there's a marble pathway around. There's like, it's kind of far away from the stupa. So to do 3 Steps One Tibetan style bow around the stupa takes about 45 minutes to do 1 round, and that's roughly 200 bows. And so I could easily keep count by, say, doing 1 round, and that's 200 bows. But it's also, doing this is also a workout, so probably about a quarter of the way through the first round, I'm sweating quite a bit, and so it's uncomfortable. And then also the ground is not very clean. A lot of people, you can still keep your shoes on that outer walking path, so people have their shoes on, they've come from outside, and the path is swept, but it isn't always mopped. It's only mopped every once in a while, certainly not every day. And so the path is dusty, and stomach, front is getting dusty, and I'm wearing gloves so my hands can slide. That's getting dusty. Forehead's getting dusty. Trying to breathe out on the one going down, so I'm not breathing in the dust. But even so, the dust is just hovering from everybody walking, bowing. There's a lot of people walking both sides, so people's feet are always scuffing next to your head, and I found it to be a pretty difficult practice, but I did do it. But then after 3 days, I got quite ill with a strong flu and fever, and was bedridden for 2 whole days. I was completely bedridden, and then when I was recovering from it, I was able to do some meditation, but couldn't do any of the bowing. And then when I recovered well enough, it was maybe then 1 week in, I had actually only done 3 full days of bowing, so that's 600 bows a day, so that was 1,800 bows that I had done up to that point before I was sick, and then I fell ill. I think it's possibly picked up something in the airport, or it could have been the dust that was just in the air, the nanoparticleized excrement that hovers over that path all the time. And so I recovered well enough, my energy came back, I was able to get back out there and keep getting my doing more bows on the 3 Steps One Vow style, or on the path. But then I had this raging sore throat, so that didn't harm my energy, but it was just an added handicap in terms of being something painful that I had to deal with while I continued these bows. And this sore throat was just very difficult for me to deal with, because it was hard to swallow. It's kind of like this experience of swallowing glass. Every time I even took a drink of water, it was just agonizing. And I remember we would have a light breakfast each day. We'd take a break at 7 a.m. and have a light breakfast. And so I would do the bowing in the morning time when it was the coolest. And after 2 rounds, we would have a light breakfast, and then I would do 1 more round. And so having this breakfast and being tired from the bowing, And I remember when it was at its worst, I just was trying to eat just some nuts and a hard-boiled egg. And tears were coming out of my eyes because it was so painful. And it was just agonizing. And I couldn't eat very much. So then that ended up lasting for about 5 days, having to deal with that kind of pain. Ended up having to take some antibiotics. And that's a little side story in and of itself, which is I went with Gautam, who many of you may be familiar with. He's Ajahn Achalo's Indian adopted son who helps look after us in Bodh Gaya. He's 22 now, super good guy, very pure-hearted. Took me to a local doctor in Bodh Gaya. So we went down these little alleyways, down into these kind of corridors and down some steps into a grotty little doctor's office with medical instruments that looked like they were taken out of the 1950s. And went and saw a nice middle-aged, upright Indian doctor in this office. He diagnosed me with tonsillitis and gave me like all these different types of antibiotics to take. And then the next day it was like 50% better. And it's such a relief. So amazing once you're sick and then you're free from that sickness. And so my reflection, being freed from that horrible sore throat, it's like the second hindrance of anger, the second hindrance. So you have the 5 hindrances to meditation. You have sensual desire, anger and ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry and doubt. And the Buddha gives analogies for each one as to what it's like. And he says anger is like sickness. Anger is like a sickness. And freedom from anger is like becoming well again. And the other ones, in case you're curious, the sensual desire is like being in debt. Freedom from sensual desire is like being freed from debt. Anger is sickness. Freedom from anger is being freed from sickness. Sloth and torpor is like being being in prison. Freedom from sloth and torpor is like being freed from prison. Restlessness and remorse is like being a slave. Freedom from restlessness is like freedom from slavery. Doubt is like walking through the desert. And freedom from doubt is like getting to the end of the desert, no longer and making safe passage across the desert, reaching the other side. So those are the analogies that the Buddha gives in one sutta in terms of describing those 5 hindrances and what it's like to be freed from them. So that became my reflection, being freed from this sore throat. It was such a relief, so wonderful, so marvelous, just to not have to have that much pain while swallowing anymore. And I remember feeling supercharged then, doing this 3 Steps One Vow. Once I was not sick anymore, just feeling like, wow, I have so much energy. This is so great. And I was like that when I arrived, but then with that reflection on having been sick and then freed from that sickness, I got these bursts of energy. And so I ended up doing a total of 3,000 vows in that style of 3 Steps One Vow. And of course, my original determination was to do 10,000 in that style. But after doing 3,000, I did a day of just meditation, of 9 hours of sitting meditation through the entire day. And I reflected on that. And I reflected that, well, if I continue doing this, there's a very real danger that I'll get sick again if I keep going on that path, 3 Steps One Vow. And I think I need to adapt my determination. And the reflection that came up was, it's a much more extreme example, but the Buddha himself making the determination as a bodhisattva to do austerities. And doing the austerities, taking it to a certain point. But even though he made the determination to do certain austerities when he was at the verge of death, which is, of course, way more extreme example, but it was a reflection that came up in my mind. He actually did adapt. He actually did say that wasn't working, and he actually did adapt. and he tried something else, and he was able to relinquish them. He didn't just keep going with it when he saw that it wasn't working. So I did, after those 3,000 vows of 3 Steps One Vow, I did adapt to then doing them in a stationary format, where I actually I acquired a bowing, like the Tibetan practitioners, they use these like linoleum, a little roll of linoleum which your hands can slide on. You use these hand sliders and a pad for your knees and stomach. And I set up a little spot for myself where I was bowing towards facing the Mahabodhistupa, and continued in that format. And I felt a bit bad about changing the determination to that, because that wasn't in line with what my original determination was. But I also felt it was actually wise to do, because if I was to continue in my original format, there was a very realistic possibility of getting sick again and not finishing any of the determinations at all. And so I continued in that format, bowing in place. Soon after I changed, I got sick again anyway. I got food poisoning. So I was laid up in bed again thinking, okay, I need to do such and such many vows, and I've made this determination. I need to do such and such many hours of meditation, and I don't know how long I'm going to be sick for. So I was laying there in bed, sick with food poisoning and vomiting, and just having to be in my room at the guest house. And so no energy at all, thinking, I need to get back to the temple. I need to get back to the temple. So my mind was leaning in that direction, inclining in that direction. But the body was just no energy. It wasn't realistic to go back. I just couldn't get myself to move. So I had a whole nother day of just laying there. And then in the morning, I felt a little bit better. Was able to go back and do some meditation, and having to gauge how much I could meditate, how much I could do these prostrations. And I remember then, after that food poisoning, doing very slow prostrations, and just very slowly. And I got really into it. I had to adapt again. I had to do them more slowly. And it is a workout. You're doing kind of a half push-up, back up, going down, half push-up down, half push-up back up, and trying to keep a mantra in mind. It's keeping Namo Sakyamuni Buddha, Namo Sakyamuni Buddha, Namo Sakyamuni Buddha in mind while doing these. Having a little counter on my finger for counting the number. And even though I was doing them very slowly, that day, after I had the food poisoning, I was able to do 1,000 prostrations in one day. So sometimes I surprised myself by going out of that comfort zone a bit, and despite sickness, despite weakness, and not through forcing myself in any way. It was more through saddha, more through faith and determination, and just the perseverance of doing it more slowly, conserving the energy, and moving forward in that way. I was still able to then eventually, by the end of the trip, complete all of the determinations, still with 2 days to spare. So I was able to finally complete these determinations. Now, in a way, these things are kind of interesting how they happen, especially at Bodh Gaya. I always have the feeling the Buddha's Barami is really there, and that is really where the Buddha attained full enlightenment. And it's a very special location. And in a way, we're receiving teachings all the time when we're in that location. Actually, we're receiving teachings all the time in any location, but especially when we go to Bodh Gaya, it's sort of heightened, and receiving teachings. In a way, I felt that upon reflection now, that actually shifting my determination to bowing in place was also humbling for me, in that when I finally completed it, I wasn't necessarily rejoicing, but there was this very sober sense of, okay, this is what the practice takes, and this is how I have to move. This is a teaching of how I have to move forward in my own practice, moving on, returning to Thailand, and then in July, eventually, if and when I am able to return to Abhayagiri in July, then how I have to move forward with that sense of perseverance and determination in any situation. So it's cultivating a certain mental attitude towards life, and that when there is obstacles that arise, that we can actually overcome them. But what it takes is the mind has to incline towards the practice. So that's why it's helpful to have, okay, I'm going to do a certain chant every day, or I'm going to do a certain amount of meditation every day. And when we determine that, then the mind inclines towards, okay, I haven't done it yet. I need to get there. I need to do it. I need to get away. I need to do the sitting meditation. I need to get away and do the walking meditation. It's very important. And to not let other things eclipse that. And even if we have to say, even if we're with a friend, and social pressure is probably one of the main factors that will keep us from practicing. Actually, social pressure is a very powerful influencer in our lives. We can have good social pressure. That's what we call Kalyana Meta. We have good social pressure, our friends who are getting us to meditate more, our teachers who are getting us to keep better virtue, keep us meditating more, keep us making determinations, keep us practicing, keeping us on the path. Those are Kalyana Meta. But then our ordinary friends will tend to cause us maybe to lean away from that a bit more. And so we have to find skillful means that we don't change. We don't want to offend our friends, and we don't want to offend our associates by saying, well, being kind of like, well, I'm going to go meditate. And our friends might think, well, what does that say about me? I'm not going to meditate. And so we don't want to be like that. But we can say things like, oh, I have a special engagement, or I have a prearranged engagement I'm going to, which is our meditation. We have our prearranged engagement with our meditation, but we don't have to say, well, I'm going to go meditate now. Say, okay, well, I've got an appointment, or I've got a prearranged arrangement. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, no problem. And then we find these opportunities to fulfill our determinations. Now, when we do certain practices, and we take on certain practices, I wanted to focus on metta practice for a little bit, because it is something that helps the mind to be incredibly wholesome, and thus can help us bolster up our determinations. Normally, and I'm just speaking from experience for myself, tending to go about our lives in a state of either low or high level, either subtle or extreme judgment and criticism in our mind all the time, and that is unwholesome, and it's normal. So not to judge and criticize ourselves more for having that. It is very normal, very ordinary, very common, and everybody has the defilements except the arhants and the Buddhas. So it is very normal, natural to have these things, but it is good to know that it causes suffering, and how do we work with it? How do we come out of it? So I tend to prefer actually Ajahn Achalo's translation of metta, which is non-judgmental awareness. We try to cultivate, and this comes through meditation as well. The metta can come about naturally when we meditate a lot, when all of our worries and problems fall away through sitting a lot, meditating a lot, and finally we stop thinking about all the issues in the world that can be thought about. Finally, we stop, the judgmental, critical mind takes a little break, and finally we're able to say, okay, what a relief. There is no problem right now. There's just no problems. There's nothing to worry about. And the mind is uplifted. And that's the wholesome mind. That's when the wholesome mind arises. And that's good to note. And when the wholesome mind arises, then there's temporarily a lack of suffering. There's temporarily a lack of grief. There's temporarily a lack of, you could even say, trauma, low-level trauma that always seems to be coming at us through the news, through just the types of things we tend to think about, or even through just being critical of other people, other practitioners who aren't practicing correctly according to how we think people should practice. So the judgmental critical mind takes a little break, and that's, for myself, that's how I think about metta practice. So that's metta arising in a very natural way. I do think about it in another way as well, that you can consciously reflect on metta, you can consciously cultivate it. And you can cultivate it for yourself. I had an experience in my 9th Vasa where I was on retreat by myself in a small monastery, and I was thinking about how do you actually have metta for yourself and trying to cultivate it, doing these phrases of may you be well, may I be well, may I be happy, may I be at ease, and doing walking meditation for many hours. And these phrases just kind of falling flat for me and not having much benefit. And I am someone who tends to be judgmental and critical of myself, i.e. not have metta for myself. So I did see, even at that time, that this needs to be done. And it was not happening. It was difficult. So there was some sort of obstruction. There was some sort of block there. But I was reflecting on it, contemplating it. Why can't I have metta for myself? And the judgmental critical mind comes up. I mean, this is backing up to when I was in Anagarika, when I was a Pakau in 2001 in Vaigiri. And I was journaling at that time. I would keep a journal. And I remember filling up a notebook with what I thought was some pretty good writing, but then going back and reading it, and every single writing was me criticizing myself. And I thought it was a good thing. I thought, okay, I'm gonna stamp out my faults. I'm gonna keep this determination, that determination of, not taking nampana or just trying to stay up all night for several nights straight. Noble things on paper, but it all came from a judgmental, critical attitude. It wasn't coming from metta for myself. So that attitude, it did get weaker, but it was only when I was 9 vasas that I could actually see it more clearly, that this is something to cultivate, to actually let go of that judgmental, critical mind, or at least be able to do it temporarily. Because I found it was draining on me, and it sapped my vitality to actually have that attitude all the time, or if not all the time, just having it often. And I remember laying down that night after a full day of trying to have metta for myself and actually starting to still thinking and pondering about it. Like Master Xuan Hua said, if we want to really achieve something, we have to be cultivating it on the path, on the pillow, and on the pot. So thinking and thinking about this all the time, getting my mind around it, and laying down kind of just in bed and thinking, this is interesting. Why isn't this working? And then started actually developing some wisdom around it in terms of seeing how I didn't have metta for myself. And then that's when it got interesting. And then I had this very heart-opening experience, which is metta. So reflecting on that experience, and it felt really good, and that judgmental critical mind did fall away at that time. And I believe I had some insight into metta practice at that time. And the heart was very full. There was a sense of fulfillment. There was a sense of no problem, no worries. So when I reflect on that type of an experience, I actually also translate metta as love, because when people say they fall in love, that's the type of experience they're describing. And yet, when we have metta for ourselves, we're no longer dependent on some exterior force. We're no longer dependent on something outside of ourselves for that feeling. We actually can cultivate that for ourselves. And if we don't cultivate that for ourselves, it's very difficult to live long-term as an ordained practitioner. So metta practice, non-judgmental awareness, love, this is something we can actually cultivate for ourselves and actually spread towards ourselves. If we're not able to do it, we're going to look for it outside. We're going to still look for it in the fulfillment of desire, or you might meet someone who you really connect with, who you end up marrying. There's going to be that feeling of love, that heart opening, that heart experience. And yet that very same thing we can cultivate for ourselves. And it's so important. And I think it's one of the reasons some monks end up not sticking with the training is because that sense of metta for oneself maybe hasn't been cultivated to that point. So if we want to practice something like asubha kammatthana or death contemplation, contemplating imagining ourselves as a corpse or imagining ourselves growing old and eventually dying, and this can be very helpful as well for cutting off thoughts of the past and the future, bringing ourselves back into the present. The asubha kammatthana, the contemplation of the unattractive nature of the body, for the insight into not self. Tan Ajahn Anan was alluding to this, talking about this at the mealtime talk today. And these practices are incredibly important to be cultivating and focusing on. But we do have to have that determination to do them every day and to actually focus on them, and just to couch them in terms of metta, in terms of not bringing that judgmental, critical mind to it. It's so common for us, and like for myself as a Westerner, no, you still can't do it. You're still no good. You've been practicing this. You're just too dumb to get it. And that's that judgmental, critical mind getting in there. Part of us thinks it's a good thing. That's why we still do it. That's how we're kind of brought up, to stamp out our bad qualities through the judgments and criticisms. But then the judgment and criticism itself is a bad quality. So the only way to get rid of it is with metta, by just dropping it. And the only way to do that is through meditating a lot, practicing a lot. We can't just do it by an act of will. It doesn't work that way. If we could just do it by an act of will, or just by doing a quick fix, a quick technique, it would be so great if that was the case. We wouldn't have to undergo years of practice and running up against walls and obstacles before we figure it out that, it's just this, I just have to be kind to myself. And that empowers us, that gives us the ability to keep moving on. I'm going to change positions. My left knee is hurting since this India trip. I'd also like to share just near the end here of this talk, just some of the experience that surprised me about doing Tibetan-style prostrations. As a Theravadan monk, we normally wouldn't do this because it's very difficult to, particularly wearing the robes. I do know there was one, so having to actually not have the robe on, set the robe aside for doing these particular prostrations. I remember Lumpur Cha seeing people doing these prostrations one time early on at Wat Pah Pong, Tibetan practitioners visiting Wat Nong Pah Pong, and he made a cheeky comment, "Oh yeah, that's really good," putting forth a lot of effort. And for a day or so, people thought he was going to change the rule at Wat Pah Pong that people would have to do full body prostrations because he liked them so much, but he ended up not doing that. But one thing was, I actually found the actual effect of doing these. It wasn't just about getting to some big number, but it was about what's the experience like of actually doing these. And I found mental clarity. It was really great for mental clarity. I found when I got really in a rhythm of doing these Tibetan-style prostrations in a balanced way, pushing myself, but not doing them too fast or too slow, then the mental clarity that came up was quite nice, quite pleasant, and a good foundation for the sitting meditation. And then with the long sitting, if I decided I would stop and sit for a day for 8, 9, or a couple days for 10 hours, then doing 4 or 5 hours in the morning and doing between 4 and 6 hours in the afternoon of sitting meditation, taking little breaks to visit the bathroom facilities, and found the interesting thing about that is, even though my own mind doesn't incline towards deep samadhi, I'm someone who thinks a lot, and yes, the mind does grow somewhat quiet sometimes, but nothing super deep or super profound, yet still just going with Buddho, 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 and cultivating mindfulness, looking at the feelings in the body and looking into the hindrances, overcoming the hindrances, just doing that for hours on end. And even though there may not have been a profound state of absorption, I would end the day and I'd feel really good, really solid, really good. And that to me is, that's what we need to be cultivating. If we have the expectation for a really profound experience, in a way, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. You might think, oh, my mind didn't get into such and such a jhana, such and such a state, and maybe I'm not on the path, maybe I'm doing it wrong, maybe I got the technique wrong. But when we practice a lot, the mind will learn at its own pace. That's very important to know. The mind will learn at its own pace, and it'll be based on our own parami, our own spiritual qualities that we've built up over this lifetime and of course, past lifetimes. So when we have determinations to practice, if we practice more than we think we can, yes, there are times we should stop. If the mind is getting very tight, maybe we should stop and go out and drop our meditation object, look at the clouds or something. But we actually can go further than we think. Yeah, and the mind will tend to feel very solid, will feel firm and stable if we're able to do that. So these are just a few reflections on my trip to India. I'm actually very happy to be back. India is not a Buddhist country. Even though you have these incredible holy sites there, India is not a Buddhist country. And leaving India, there's that same feeling. Just took so long to get through the Gaya airport, and there's so many checkpoints, and they're so slow, and they're checking your bag they're just like making you pull everything out of your bag, and then there's another checkpoint, and just it just seemed to happen so slowly. And getting on the plane, and what a relief, going back to a Buddhist country. And getting back to Bangkok, and actually, so if anybody hasn't been to India, it's a very, very loud place. So I'd maybe recover from an illness or something and think, oh, tonight I'm going to get a good rest. And then there'd be a wedding. So these Indian weddings right next door to our guest house, and there'd be fireworks and loud drums until 2 a.m. So one night I was startled awake by what sounded like gunshots right outside of my window. And it was fireworks they'd thrown up, and they exploded right outside of my window. And India is and everybody's honking all the time with the traffic, and it's just crazy. And you kind of get numb to it if you're there for a month or longer. Getting back to Bangkok, I just felt like, oh yeah, it's so quiet here and orderly and clean. In Bangkok, in the past, I never thought of Bangkok in that way, but being in India, certainly coming to Bangkok, oh, so nice, such a relief to come back. Happy to have gone. Sad to be leaving the Vajrasana, but just so happy to be back in Thailand, and happy to be back where all of my fellow practitioners are, and back where the monasteries are, with the Krupa Ajahns. Oh, it's so wonderful to be here. It's such a good opportunity. And in closing, it's good to remind ourselves too, just what we do have here. It's not ordinary, it's not normal. And what we do have here is very, very precious, this opportunity to practice in a Buddhist country, in a place where people have attained insight, and we're able to hear the teachings, say, in this monastery of Tan Ajahn Ñāniko, which are I find to be incredibly clear and helpful. And it's quite a wonderful opportunity. So it's good to remind ourselves of that, buoy ourselves up. That can also help us, the cultivation of gratitude as to what we have can also help us to let go of that judgmental, critical mind, that judgmental, critical nature. So I hope these words are helpful for everybody, and it can help you to be less judgmental and critical and more determined in your practice and cultivate more perseverance, and helpful in terms of giving yourself quite a bit of encouragement to practice. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for the Dhamma talk. It's actually exciting that you're here, because just a few weeks ago I've made some determination potentially to go to Abhayagiri with the thought of ordaining. So it's funny that you're here in Thailand. But my question is, I have sometimes a difficulty knowing what thinking to trust and what not to trust. And just, I don't know exactly how to form it as a question, but like in making a determination, how do you know that it's a correct determination? And maybe just as long as it's towards practice, it's right, or?
Yeah. What the question is, what thinking to trust and not to trust. It's a very good question, because at first it's good to not trust almost any of it, and it's a great blessing to have the Vinaya and the Buddha's rules and code of conduct to follow. And it's a great blessing to be in a monastery as well, because we don't actually have to think very much. We just have to follow the schedule. And the thinking is more something that's coming up, and we can watch it more like a movie, like we're reflecting on it. We're going to have all sorts of thoughts like, I don't know about this monastery, or the Ajahn did this and that was kind of strange, and so the very best, Luang Por Chah can be quoted saying the quickest way to enlightenment is to point at all of your thoughts and say, liar. But the way I also have a bit of interpretation about that is, over time, as the mind gets more wholesome, yes, some of those thoughts will be trustworthy. And over time, something I've learned just for myself is that the more unwholesome the mind is, the more the mind will lie to you. But as the mind becomes more wholesome and you cultivate more metta, and the mind starts to develop in the meditation, and it will be a bit more trustworthy. So the wholesome mind tends to be more trustworthy, and the unwholesome mind is definitely not trustworthy. But that takes meditation practice to start to see, okay, what is anger like? What is greed like? The Buddha said, we had the Buddha to tell us those are unwholesome states. It would be so hard to figure out on our own. So it's a great blessing that we have the Buddha's teachings. So what is anger like? Taking anger as an example. Okay, well, if I believe that those thoughts of irritation or anger, and I even act on those, is that suffering or is that not suffering? So really the focus has to be seeing the suffering, seeing if our mental states cause suffering. So if we're meditating and we've got some sort of mental proliferation that starts going, and then it's been going for 30 minutes or so, and then we notice our face is all puckered up and we're very, very tense, that's a state of suffering. And so when we see that state of suffering, we can say, oh, that mental state caused suffering. So that's really, we can simplify it to that. And then we can consciously calm, consciously ease it, and see, okay, let's calmly go back to this meditation object, whether it was the feeling of the breath or Bhutto, mentally reciting Bhutto. We can take it back to that when we notice that. That's both the cultivation of mindfulness and the cultivation of wisdom. It's how we slowly learn, little by little. And if we're going to suffer a lot in the course of the practice, but it's the suffering that leads to the ending of suffering, if we're able to see that way. The Buddha classed things as unwholesome if they lead to suffering, and he classed them as wholesome when they lead to happiness and liberation. So in the suttas, like from an academic aspect, the jhanas being very heavy, wholesome states that are very, very ripe and full and heavy in terms of the wholesome. And then there's also very heavy, unwholesome states, like really strong, like acting on really strong anger, for example, like attacking somebody. That would be like a very, very unwholesome. That would be the other side of the spectrum. So it really just comes with time and experience to know what to trust. And there's going to be times when you trust the wrong things, and that's okay. So we have to be very forgiving with ourselves as well. So that's why we have the teachings of the practitioners who've come before us. They can speak from experience to these things. And it still blows my mind that the Buddha figured these things out. I can't believe it without a teacher. Yes, we do have the suttas, but without live teachers and guides, I just don't. My own opinion is I don't think it would be possible to make much progress on the path. Like, say, just using the suttas. Because the suttas are also translations, and you get the feeling of whoever translated which sutta. They might have very subtle biases or not so subtle, and it's just so helpful to, say, have Luang Por Chah's teachings, for example, just to see, oh yeah, this is a practitioner who actually really overcame these things, and this was his experience, and we can apply that to ourselves. Very good question.
Ajahn, there's a question online. Dear Ajahn, I'm unable to control my craving for sensual pleasures, such as delicious food. Sorry? Yeah. And such as delicious food and comfort. Sometimes I feel that my practice is taking 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. Any advice, please? Thank you.
It's okay. It's okay if you enjoy delicious food. I also enjoy delicious food. That's why I'm getting fatter at this moment. But, it is, yes, yeah, you can say, well, there is this craving there, and the important thing is seeing the suffering of it. But also, I think in this type of a case, what's causing more suffering is that judgment and criticism of ourselves. And it's really important to address that rather than the externals. The Buddha's always pointing back to the heart. The Kruvajan's always pointing back to the heart. So what's important is when we eat delicious food, how do we react to it? We might have craving for it. We will have these types of cravings until very, very advanced levels of the path. And even very advanced practitioners, anagamis, will have preferences for food and like certain foods and not like other foods. It's not about not having likes and dislikes, but it's more about not being a slave to them. So when you don't have that delicious food, what is it like for you? Contemplate that. How much do you suffer when it's not there? If you don't suffer very much when that delicious food is not there, if you're not able to get it, then you're already good. You already have that contentment that's built up. So if you don't suffer very much when the food isn't there, then you have the food, and yes, you enjoy it. You might delight in having that good food, but you're not actually as attached to it as you think you are. More of the problem is that habitual judging and criticizing yourself. So that's really important to be addressing.
Another question. Hi Ajahn, may I know if doubt is an unwholesome state? As Buddha also taught us not to believe everything, we have not experienced it for ourselves. Thank you for your guidance.
Yeah, doubt in terms of the hindrances, yes, doubt is unwholesome. Yes, we don't want to blindly believe everything we see, hear, read, whatever, everything people tell us. But that's not what the Buddha means by doubt. Doubt is perplexity as to what's wholesome and unwholesome in terms of the hindrances. And it really is, the Buddha uses that analogy of walking through a desert. You're lost in the desert. So that's the analogy the Buddha uses for doubt, is you're lost in the desert and you don't really know which direction to go. It's just hot and uncomfortable, sand on all sides, and that's doubt. The Buddha uses another analogy for doubt in another sutta where he uses different types of water, or water in different states for each hindrance. And for the hindrance of doubt, it's like muddy water in the dark. So the water both isn't clean and it's in the dark. So you can't see because of the mud, and you also can't see because it's dark. And the way to overcome doubt is not to answer the questions. So we have different doubts. Am I doing the right practice? Am I in the right place? Am I really supposed to be doing this? Is the Buddha really enlightened? Is there really past lives? Are these people, what are these people talking about? So it's perplexity. And one way to understand what the Buddha is talking about when he talks about doubt, and the Pali word is vicikicca, when he's talking about doubt, we can think about the qualities of a sotapanna, of a stream enterer, one who's attained the first level of awakening, in order to understand what doubt is in terms of what the Buddha is talking about. Yes, it is good to ask questions. Asking questions and clearing up those types of doubts, asking questions and clearing up those types of doubts is the path to wisdom. The Buddha talked about that in the suttas. We're supposed to actually go to the teachers, ask questions, clear up those kind of doubts. Doubt as a hindrance is a hindrance to meditation. If it's there, the mind isn't going to go very deep. If it's there, the mind isn't going to be peaceful. And when we think about the qualities of a sotapanna, then doubt is one of the things that falls away. So sotapanna no longer has doubt. And the Buddha describes that in two ways. One, he says one is no longer in doubt of Buddha Dhamma Sangha, but also, and perhaps something I find more useful, is that one is no longer perplexed as to what is a wholesome and unwholesome state. So when the doubt falls away, you have a clear sense of right and wrong, wholesome and unwholesome. And that, again, comes through experience and through practice. And so, yes, it is good to clear up the types of doubts in terms of what practice maybe I should be doing. Maybe you can talk with a senior monk or a teacher who you trust. Then those types of doubts, yes. Remember Tan Ajahn Jeff of What Meta Monastery visited Abhayagiri just before I came to Thailand, and we had a Q&A session with him, and somebody asked about doubt. And I thought he answered it quite brilliantly. He said, well, there's two types of doubt. There's doubt that wants to be answered, and there's doubt that doesn't want to be answered. The doubt that doesn't want to be answered is the hindrance. The doubt that does want to be answered is, yeah, you have an actual question. It's going to give you some helpful knowledge. That's not a bad thing. That's good. However, the doubt that doesn't want to be answered is just that habitual mind state of doubt. And the only way to get rid of that is to see doubt as doubt. Answering the question is not going to put it into it. It's just going to have another question. And so people who are doubting types, who are constantly doubting, should I be here, shouldn't I be here, what's wholesome, what's unwholesome, am I doing the right thing, and are unable to actually just drop that doubt within the monastic form. Say if you ordain and you're in the monastic form, you can just drop that doubt and do the schedule, and the meditation will develop, the practice will develop. But for doubting types, the mind is habitually locked on through clinging and attachment. It's habitually locked on to that state of doubt. And it's just a state of doubt. It's not about, and delusion is telling us, so doubt is a state of delusion in terms of the hindrances, and delusion is telling us, if you just answer that question, you won't doubt anymore. But that's not the case. You answer the question, it just goes on to something else immediately. And that state of doubt is a great state of suffering. So we have to see the suffering of that doubt, to see the suffering of it. It's very, very important.
Thank you, Ajahn. Ajahn, do you have time to take one more question, or I think
appointments currently, so however long people want to keep asking questions, I suppose.
Next question, may I ask Ajahn, how do you continue to practice metta to oneself and others in a sangha if you don't quite trust a political sangha member? Thank you.
Again, this is something that comes about because the mind is still tends toward the unwholesome. If we end up having that judgmental, critical mind towards other people, say based on their political standing, as an example, when the mind gets really wholesome, there's not going to be a problem having metta for everybody. And so seeing the suffering of that is the important part, rather than focusing on the other person and hoping they're going to change. And we can only really change ourselves. We can't hope that other people are going to change. So from a Dhamma perspective, just coming back to that for ourselves, the non-judgmental critical mind, Luang Por Chua also said a good rule for practitioners is that we focus on ourselves 90% and on others 10%. So if we're focusing on others, unless you say you gain insight or you become a teacher where you end up needing to focus on others more in order to teach them and help them be free of suffering themselves. That's a good rule of thumb. Focus on yourself 90%, others 10%. And if the focus on somebody else is just causing our mind to become more unwholesome, i.e. we're suffering over it, then to really look at the judgmental critical mind and to question ourselves, to be able to reflect on ourselves. How are we relating to this? And what's my experience of this? So it is possible to do, but it is difficult. We're kind of hardwired to be judgmental and critical of others. It's just something in the modern age. It's the way of thinking that seems to have built up in the modern age, and it takes a lot of time and practice to undo that. And on a side note, it is a very good reflection in these times because there is big divisions in terms of people's, say, political opinions in the world and opinions about all sorts of things, that if somebody has a different opinion than us and we hold our opinion very strongly and the other person holds their opinion very strongly and they're very different, and we might think like, I can't have metta for that person. It's not possible. And yet this is a good test for us to show us where we're at as practitioners. Somebody who disagrees with us, or somebody we see as maybe a threat, that's the very definition of an enemy. So metta towards enemies is one of the levels of metta that we're supposed to be able to cultivate. And if we're not able to do that, then that shows us that's where we're at. We're not yet able to have metta for people who we see as a threat or who are disagreeable to us, and who are, enemy is a strong word, but that's kind of the definition of enemy in terms of metta is someone who we see as a threat, someone who's disagreeable to us, someone who we find distasteful, we find their views distasteful perhaps. Can we have goodwill for that person? And really, I think the way to do it is the mind actually has to be wholesome before we're able to do it. And for the mind to be wholesome and allow ourselves to do something like that, then we actually do need to drop the judgmental critical nature and be able to say, there's no problem. There's nothing to worry about in this moment. There's nothing to fix. It's just this body and mind that I'm practicing with. So it's a very good way to relate to it.
Rajan, there's a question on the guidance to practice Mahasatipatthana. Is it recommended to practice one by one, or is it recommended to practice like all together, or any general guidance?
Yeah, it's really, there are these different interpretations of it. I can just give my own opinion, is that I actually think of it not as the 4 foundations of mindfulness, but as the 4-fold foundation of mindfulness. And so I think they're all linked together when you, of course, like somebody like Luang Por Mun, he focused, in his recorded teachings anyway, he focused almost exclusively on mindfulness of the body. And a lot of the Kruba Ajahns, they talk about just mindfulness of the body. And I do think Kayagata Sati leads into all of the others, in that when you have mindfulness of the body has feelings. And so mindfulness of the body, whether you're thinking about the 32 parts of the body or the 4 elements or the 9 charnel ground contemplations or any other way of thinking about mindfulness of the body, this does bleed into mindfulness of feeling, because like I have a pain in my left knee right now, and I can be mindful of that. I can know there's this diffuse pain in my left knee kind of going up my going up my quad muscle right now. And that's also one part of mindfulness of the body, and it's unpleasant. And I can see that that's unpleasant, and I can make note of that. I don't have to react to it. And so that's mindfulness of the body. And then and mindfulness of feelings, and based on our feelings, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, then the mind that's chitta nupassana, the mind reacts to the feelings. Like, I like this, I don't like this, I want this to go away. And the mind has different states. We know what mind state the mind is in. And Dhamma nupassana is, you have like the 5 faculties and the 6 sense bases, the 5 khandhas. This is like the framework with all the other 3 satipatthanas. We use those, a Noble Eightfold Path, we use those in order to cultivate more mindfulness of the body. And so I think they all go together. Yeah. But for myself, I like to focus more on mindfulness of the body because it does just lead into the others naturally. And I find it very useful to do things like charnel ground contemplations, where I'm imagining the body as a corpse and as bones, like entry into not self. That's an entry into anatta, by imagining so much of our sense of self is built up with our face. Imagining just a skull and just bones on the ground, it can be a good entry into anatta, into not self. Yes, I think they all go together, but each person will have their own way also of interpreting it.